You listen to this podcast because you like books, or maybe because you like learning, or maybe you just like the sound of my voice lulling you to sleep. If it's the first two, Audible has you covered. Too busy to read? Driving and don't want to run into another dog? Audible is a huge library of audiobooks where people read to you like you're a kid again. And guess what? You can try it out for free. Just go to readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to sign up for your free trial today.
So his argument, as I see the case in the chapter, is that World War I is not supportable or substantiable by any reasonable grounds of logical argument as why we're actually doing this thing and for what benefit and to what end. And, does it fit within a moral code that is acceptable based on the world as we know it?
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 15. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with Ward Regan about his book, Great Books Written in Prison. Ward Regan has a PhD in Labor and Cultural History from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. He teaches history and philosophy at New York University's Liberal Studies program. He edited and contributed to Great Books Written in Prison, published in 2015 by McFarland Press. His chapter, Thomas Paine, Life During Wartime, was published in the anthology Experiencing the French Revolution, published by Oxford University in 2013. He was also a consulting producer for the documentary Obit, released in 2017. Dr. Regan was the first president of UAW 7902, the Adjunct Faculty Union at New York University and the New School. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live. This is John Monaster. I am here with my esteemed guest, Ward Regan, to talk about his book, Great Books Written in Prison. Ward, say hello.
Hi, everybody.
Cool. Thanks for joining, Ward. I'm really excited because this book is really interesting and I learned a lot of very surprising things, so I'm really excited to get into it. But I'd love to start off with a general summary. So why don't you go ahead and tell us what the book is all about?
It's one of those books where the title is about as self-explanatory as possible. It's about books, in this case primarily books or plays that were written or began in prison for the most part. There are one or two exceptions to the rule, but in general that's what they are. And they're great because they have some sort of significance, literary, cultural, historical, sets them apart from other texts in that regard. So very straightforward premise. The text is what the title says it is.
I like it. So why did you decide to write this?
I was thinking about that question as I saw it on your list, and I don't know I don't know if I have an answer to why I decided to write it. That implies some form of intent. And I don't know that I had any intent in that regard. It came to me as an idea, and I figured someone else had done it, but I checked and no one had done it. But lots of people had lists of books written in prison or of a similar nature on Amazon and Google and all sorts, Barnes and Noble, but no one had written a book. So that's, it's not maybe the most deep academic or spiritual of answers, but it just happened in that regard.
Had an idea and
yeah.
no one else did it?
Well, and again, in the introduction, I sort of say that we teach a lot of these texts in my courses, and I know in many, everywhere across the United States and the world. And to find out that some of them are written in prison or in these conditions, as you said, is really quite surprising. So there was then a theme that emerged, but it was more like and then no one had written a book, and okay, I guess I could try.
So yeah, getting into that a little bit, what was your process like? And knowing that you didn't write everything in the book, you edited it primarily.
I started to do it first on my own, I thought. And then in that regard, I had initially narrowed it down thematically speaking to great books written in prison by artists and writers or something. But then I still realized that it would be bullshit because all I would be doing is brushing up on these people and then spitting it back out. So I realized that I couldn't alone cover a book of this scope, so I just stopped. Although I had gathered all the preliminary necessary information to write a book, if one went to, certainly to make a proposal. And then several years later, 2 years later, I was doing the politics club at the department I'm in at NYU, Liberal Studies, and one of my colleagues gave a talk on Egyptian politics, and he mentioned the book written by Syed Khib, I think is the correct pronunciation of his last name, Khib, In the Shade of the Quran and Milestones. And it dawned on me that I was teaching with a whole bunch of people who knew all these things, and if I asked, could probably write a chapter. And that, therefore, I should get other people to do the work. Or a lot of the work.
And what was the hardest part of that process?
Well, I mean, get the beginning process, getting people to agree, and then getting people's work. From an intellectual perspective, once the thing was set, the thing was set. There wasn't a lot of brain work involved in like refining it. It was more the mechanics of getting a book written and published. I mean, I don't know. I can't speak I don't know. I can't speak for my writers, but for me personally, it was getting their stuff in a timely fashion, getting my stuff done in a timely fashion, and then finishing it as a project.
So there's obviously a limited number of books here, and you could have picked from a vast range. So I wanted to get into what makes a book great and why you picked these particular great books.
I think I can easily answer the table of contents. There were like 35 books that fit the category that I had decided was acceptable for whatever reason for this thing. And then I sent out a general call to my colleagues, and this is about the number of people who came back, and this is more or less the chapters they wanted to agree to write. And they said, okay. And there were a couple more chapters, and by the time it was accepted by the publisher, I wrote again, and some people said, oh, shite, I can't do it, sorry. So it shrunk, which was fine, because editing fewer chapters is more life-affirming than editing more chapters. Right. So, yeah, that's how it came together. I sought out folks who I taught with, who I knew were good in what they were doing, so I wasn't recreating the wheel. They all could approach their subject from their special academic training, and that just seemed to make sense. So I pulled it together and ran it as a project, and then worked with my colleagues on the conceptual and intellectual part of it. But they did obviously the bulk of the writing.
Right. And you talk about prison a bit in the introduction. Maybe talk about what prisons are used for and why it's important to think about books that were written by people while they were in prison.
I think the first thing is to clarify that, like I say in the intro or the preface or whatever, that prisons, as that word is used now, really only pertains to things within the last 250 so odd years of Western civ and then global culture. But there were other forms of incarceration. So I'd say there's like a historical answer to the question, and there's a contemporary answer to the question, and of course the contemporary answer to the question will be argued from multiple different sides. So I would say that it's always something for a means of control. Prisons and, as Foucault calls it, the carceral system. Everyone can debate about what is it that's being policed. And then what is being policed often dictates who's doing the policing. Sometimes they merge. So like, in current Saudi Arabia and apparently, I guess, ancient Israel in the time of judges, you had a theocracy where if you broke a moral law, it was also a political thing. So in that regard, it's how does it affect the way state institutions control people? And prison systems historically are an effective means of keeping people in control. Control can be both physical and or mental. Previous to 250 years ago, it was a much less institutionalized bureaucracy that you and I would recognize as an institution. Mm-hmm. And prison terms didn't exist in the same way because you would just get punished for something and then let go. Like hypothetically beaten, whipped, maybe have a hand cut off, and then you're kind of like branded, then you're kind of like free to go about your life branded. They didn't have this sort of long-term domestic incarceration. Many of the authors in the book were incarcerated in the pre-modern era, but they were singled out for that incarceration. That's a historically consistent thing, that leaders, kings, queens, whomever, will turn the prison or carceral system against specific individuals or specific groups and use it that way in a very personal sense. But that's not necessarily what we would understand as prison, right? So there's that historical break, and I represent that in the book to a certain degree. By the time Thoreau is writing about prisons, there already began to be the modern conception of, this whole panopticon. Prison started in the late 18th century, where it was mostly supposed to be rehabilitation. I would say that the prison systems in the instances in these texts were not necessarily rehabilitory, they were punitive. So prisons then also form a punitive process in a culture. And as I pointed out, in the modern era, they've become out of the public eye because you go from the visual public trials and or executions and watching the machinery of justice happen to these large physical buildings, courts and prisons and police stations that are all interior. Everything happens inside that space now. We know it exists as a large cultural institution, but we don't get to witness it anymore. Yeah, it's opaque. Yes, exactly. So there is that shift there, and again, I'd say it's about a 250 year window into modernity.
Okay, yeah. So let's jump into the books and authors. The book begins with Plato and Socrates. When Plato was writing, you see that Socrates made enemies by challenging the social order of the day. He encouraged his students to do this and constantly pushed himself as well. It made me wonder the extent to which we should constantly be challenging the social order and follow in his footsteps. I was wondering if you had thoughts about whether we should be doing this and whether that's related to the idea of working within an institution to change it or fighting from the outside.
I think it applies in a sense more to Thoreau, the question of how do you act when you think a state is unjust. In Plato and Socrates' death, the message he was giving long story short, Socrates spent his life criticizing shit, and at some point Athens needed someone to blame for the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, and they blamed him, and they said, you're a traitor, and they corrupted him, so we send you to death. He was given multiple opportunities to escape, and he didn't. His deal was, as a member of this polis, I have to agree to what the things are, even if I don't necessarily like them. So he allowed himself to be executed in the name of what the Romans might call civitas, the community, because he's part of it. Thoreau, on the other hand, later, and which is, again, modernity is different, would fight that concept that the state doesn't have the right, shouldn't have the right, and if it does claim the right, you should struggle against it having it to sort of take your life. To take your life for the type of things that Socrates was accused of. He didn't raise an army against the Athenian state. He didn't murder anybody. He was accused essentially for being dangerous, but intellectually, which then meant politically.
Thoreau kind of came around to his more extreme point of view. It seemed like he was talking about active resistance.
I think, part of that reaction is the general misunderstanding on some level of what Thoreau was about. And I, like many, learned more about how much resistance he thought was acceptable. Thoreau is not a pacifist by any stretch of the imagination, and neither is Gandhi really either, because he actually does say, you're an idiot if there's nothing left to defend yourself, then use violence. You got to fight back, right? And that's a little different in some ways than the totality of Sahigraha, but we can get to that later. I think the Thoreau thing is more important because how you respond to it is about how you are acquiescing or not to a system which is used to control people for what would arguably be political ends.
Totally switching, I was pretty much amazed to find out the modern King Arthur was written by somebody while they were in prison.
I was surprised too, and then I found out that was what also that same era, the War of the Roses, is what Game of Thrones is based on. Yeah. And then the life of Thomas Mallory made a lot more sense when I knew that. watching what he did as a person was, this rogue, knight. And there's this funny thing, which I can't remember. It doesn't make into the summary, and I honestly can't remember if it's in the chapter. It must have been. Well, I don't know. I did some research on my own. Anyway, he's often accused of having stolen stuff, which is why he was a criminal, and money in particular. Right. But the amount of money he usually stole was apparently either 40 or 80 pounds, which was the general salary of a knight if you were employed by somebody at that time. So I can see Mallory seeing himself as trying to get nothing but his due given his status and service in life. But yeah, that he was caught up in this political struggle, and then ended up in a place where he wrote King Arthur. I had no idea.
Yeah, and it almost seems like he was using it as escapism. He was creating this lost world of heroes and knights.
Yeah, the range of books, some of which are not included here, obviously, because like I said, there were at least 35 when I did my initial search. There are a couple themes that emerge. One is obviously escapism. One is engageism, and one is sort of tangential. It's interesting to wonder if his writing here was an attempt to escape, or was it actually a way to make a statement about the present moment as well. It's a very interesting thing. But, is it reactionary or is it romantic?
The essay gets into the fact that there was matricide, infanticide, patricide, all this crazy stuff. I mean, it really made me think about the differences there when you talk about escapism versus engagement.
Either he was trying to make up a reason to justify whatever he was engaged in and what was going on around him, or he was really looking for a way to move away from it. It's hard to say. Again, it's an interesting thing is, did he act with honor or not? And like other members of the warrior class, use that for lack of a better term, in many cultures at many different times, they've done theoretically what their appropriate social role was, and yet they find themselves at loose ends as to what to do. So how do you behave?
Yeah, that's interesting you bring it up like that. I can see a lot of similar problems we're having today, in the sense that we have a lot of problems with veterans coming back from wars.
The Hells Angels were started by World War II veterans in California. It's always interesting how that resonates. And, questions about how people in the state are affected by war go all the way back to other Greek writers other than Plato. During his time, I think the Republic was written in a sense, and the stuff about Socrates was written in response to what happened to Greece, one of them being the Peloponnesian Wars. So questioning how do you allow people to run things and how do you allow people to criticize things. Socrates coming out on the losing end of that argument.
Oh, indeed. And the next chapter talked about Don Quixote. Sean Eve wrote about Don Quixote and said the book becomes a field of action where self-awareness and societal critique challenge conquest as one of the primary drivers of change within a rapidly expanding world. And you and I met at an event where you discussed the idea of art as a way of challenging people with different viewpoints. How does that fit in with that idea? And what are some modern-day examples of the same phenomenon?
I mean, this comes down to, at the talk we met at, is discussing art at different historical moments as well, right? Mm-hmm. So on some level, the Quixote novel is an epic poem. And in that way, it belongs to one age. It also belongs to the age of the beginning of the novel. And so then epic poems tend to be ones that laud the social structure and give credence to their moral values, i.e. like the Greek ones. And novels don't necessarily have to do that. And so in the case of Cervantes, I think, and I think Sean is arguing, that art here is being used self-consciously now to make a statement that is critical of many elements of the either social order or the ruling elite who control that social order, right? Many aspects of the socio-political system that he would argue are unfair, unjust.
Do you think maybe that's one of the ways in which the modern novel was then birthed? Was movement from something that accepts the social order to one that questions it?
That's a very interesting question. I had never thought about the novel. Dates from it's essentially an 18th century thing, right? Because you had to have printing presses that were quick enough to print things, and you had to have people who could read things. So from the 16th or even maybe 17th to the 19th century, European and Western Atlantic community literacy, exploded. And so then all of a sudden there was a reading public, and you made a new thing. Like when there wasn't the internet, nobody had YouTube stars. So all of a sudden you had writers. What the fuck's a writer, right? That was a brand new thing. So the dynamics now of what could be consumed might change because of how it could be consumed. An epic poem has to be remembered, generally. It's a nonverbal event. I mean, they are written down at some point, a la Homer. But even Homer was often still memorized and read or spoken. Novels are meant to be, depending on who you're going to ask exactly, and yes, with certain nuanced differences, both meant to be read alone and in a group, depending on lots of different factors. So in this case, yeah, it can be very critical because it can be disseminated in ways that are different from previous modes of storytelling. And I want to just add, though, that's not to say that folklore or mythology or whatever didn't ever cast a doubtful eye on the dominant ideology, right? Because when Odysseus goes down to Hades and runs into Achilles and says, hey, what do you regret the most? He essentially says, I regret buying into the whole be a hero thing. I should have lived longer. I mean, that's a repudiation,
Right.
directly. And that's an epic poem, so that's an interesting thing. But yeah, I think the novel, I think things that enter the modern era, because of the way they can be disseminated, change what we will define as art, because that's what the talk that you met me at was about, is like, how do we think of, how do we imagine, how do we use art, with a capital A, in, the current moment.
Yeah, fair enough. The next essay is one you wrote about Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. Obviously, that book is hugely important in so many ways. One little nugget I got from there is Paine's highlighting of the historical connections between church and state. To what extent do you feel those connections still exist in our government or in other governments around the world? And how does that affect their legitimacy or ability to govern?
The question or the problem that Paine had about the relationship between state and religion is still active and important, not only in the United States, but on, I would argue, every country in the world to one degree or another. His main argument was that they used the same stories, the same mythology, and played on the same ignorance of their subjects or their parishioners to tell stories, fantastical stories, that justified and then kept them in control. And so he would say, you read this silly story about how God acted, and then you are led to believe that that's the way you should act. And these two institutions of state and monarchy often, as I said in the book, sort of point to one another to justify their importance. The state says, oh yeah, the church is very important, and the church turns around and says, oh yes, the monarch must be sanctified. And given the point in time you're talking about, the church and state, which we'll just sort of use as rough definitions, are in a certain tension with one another, because in ancient civilizations like Ur, for example, there was no difference. The king, the monarch, was a god. So church and state were synonymous. Right. So the founding fathers and others in the 18th century who sought the division of those two institutions were radical, no matter where they were coming from. And it's still not a settled, obviously, question in the United States, and much less so even in other parts of the world. So hugely relevant.
Again, I'm going to ask nothing but big questions, but do you see any solutions or anything we can do here?
Now, I guess you define we in one way or another. Obviously, the first we is make sure you do your best to be a good person to other people, which is essentially what Paine says religions require of you. All of them, regardless of the mythology that surrounds them. God wants you to be good to other people. Anything beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it's viewed as a problem. I don't think trying to inculcate people with separate ideas than they have in a deliberate intent to like to secularize them is necessarily a winning or desirable project. I mean, Paine wrote his book to make a simple argument to people like, hey, read this and, you know, think about it for a while. And if you come around to where I'm seeing, great. And if not, okay, we'll go from there. And you write letters and you write nasty letters. I mean, and there were so many nasty letters written about that book in particular. It's hysterical. Like Paine's books, it caused tons of other things to be written. And I happened to be reading a letter from John Adams to Abigail Adams in which he was very excited about the fact that the visiting minister, and I think it must have been Philadelphia, gave a thunderous speech against Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. So this must have been some early age, moment in the Federalist period where no one liked Paine because he was saying that religion was a bunch of bunk. And he would say that for any society and any religion. It's not an exclusionary statement. The book tends to center on the Abrahamic ones, and Christianity even the most, but he would apply it to all states and to all religious institutions and to, on some level then, all religious belief systems.
So Bertrand Russell talked about this analytic philosophy. That was his kind of thing. And it's about attempting to uncover what people meant to mean when they say things that are vague and confusing. And he specifically says the aim is to make sure that every statement represents an adequate picture of reality, of the facts of the world. And to me, this obviously this has huge implications for our lives today, among alternative facts and all that. So I was curious, does this idea of analytic philosophy have a place in today's modern world? How can we use that?
Okay, so like disclaimer, by no means am I any specialist on Bertrand Russell. So, except that I'm, aware enough of him as part of a general program to teach, around and about him.
Yeah.
So the guy who wrote this is a real good expert. So, to put it most simply, his idea of analytical philosophy and accuracy, which might be equated with truth, and I guess I may end up using, I apologize, a lot of conditional words, because so much of reality is conditional or contextual in some sense, may start with like the Benthamites, right? Like, how do you judge something's good or bad? How do you judge if something's true or false? And so if you're going to be talking, and this is the case of Bertrand Russell in World War I, if you're going to be talking about making decisions about some of the biggest elements of a society, like sending people to war to die, right?
Yeah.
You really, really, really should know what it is exactly you think you're talking about when you use whatever words it is you use to describe the need to do this really, really, really big and important and heavy-duty thing. And in the case of Bertrand Russell, as a pacifist, and I'm trying to remember, he may have been a pacifist that still allowed, like for Thoreau, a level of physical self-defense, right? I mean, even Gandhi, to a degree had some of that. But in the case of World War I and then later, like the Vietnam War, wars he felt obviously of choice, obviously ones where the populace were being dragged into it. It was the crime, as many people have already said, like the crime that all other crimes then stem from. So if you don't know exactly why it is you're going to war, you've got a big problem there. I mean, if you want to talk, I think these books, and I think the questions these books raise are material at all times, because in many ways society hasn't changed. It's just sort of faster and more technologically adept at disseminating information. But if why did you do this really dramatic, important, expensive thing that is not an act of nature? Many people, we almost think of war now as an act of nature over which there's no control, like a rainstorm or a tornado or just a disaster. but it's a human-made event. It's a socially made, politically made event. So when you say you're going and fighting for freedom, or you're protecting democracy, or you're protecting the revolution, or you're protecting whomever, and you're getting the bad guy, whomever that gets described at, he would really, really, really want to know, are you right in that assertion? And can you support it? So his argument, as I see the case in the chapter, is that World War I is not supportable or substantiable on any reasonable grounds of logical argument as why we're actually doing this thing and for what benefit and to what end. And, you know, does it fit within a moral code that is acceptable based on the world as we know it?
All right. So we've talked about Gandhi a couple times briefly, but so Gandhi had, and then the chapter was titled this idea of Satyagraha.
I believe that's how it's pronounced, but I'm not right.
Sounds good. So it's a new term, and he got some help in coining it, but maybe talk about what that means and why he felt like he needed to coin a new term at all.
Again, here's an instance where my knowledge is really filtered through Martin's chapter, although, of course, you know, I did some reading to understand deeper myself. I think, if again my memory serves, it's more of a repurposed term than a totally invented one. But I think either way, the choice of a specific word in this instance that was new, let's just admit it's new in some way, is meant to then dislocate it from all other previous possible cultural associations. Mm-hmm. You know, it's revolutionary in that regard. And many revolutions, and we see this, you start with the French Revolution or the Reformation in Europe, started by like tearing down some way of doing something. And Satyagraha, in a sense, tears down the way you resist political oppression and puts in its place a revolutionary new mode of political self-defense and maybe even offense, depending on how you look at things, in a new situation. And so maybe that's why he used what we are thinking of as a new word. It really needs to be distinguished from something else. Like, I mean, for example, if I just can make a modern comparison, I mean, does anyone really think neoconservative and neoliberal clarify things so much, given that liberal and conservative have already become so muddy? So then in the case of Satyagraha, like you did in the French Revolution, you got to start with new stuff, new definitions for things, new understandings of things, maybe even new things to be worried about in the first place.
Right.
So conceptually speaking, it's the idea of vanquishing your enemy, and vanquished in interesting terms, because that it's. He admitted that, like, you know, nature is violent, and there are certain violence inherent in even just the cycle of life, with animals eating and killing and eating each other, and you know. But this was a way of conquering one's enemy or foe or oppressor with your own ability to seemingly rise to a higher level of concern about self and about community and about morality. So again, maybe that's why he thought of it as a new term, because it's transcendental in as much as it is also political.
So the chapter after Gandhi talked about Nehru, and Thoreau talked about the Discovery of India book, which is this epic book, and it is the history of India, and it sort of both explicitly and implicitly counters the prevailing Western notions of India. So I just was curious about what some of those notions were that were countered, and kind of how this book really set the stage for Nehru, who then went on to become India's first elected prime minister.
I think there's a lot of dimensions to that question. I think the easy, in a sense, can you hear me okay still?
Yeah.
I think the easy question, in a sense, to the question about what Western notions does it challenge are pretty much the same for all Western colonial experiences: exoticism, submission, otherism, exploitation, lack of civilization, lack of ability to rule oneself, so on and so on and so forth. So, pardon me, the story of the conquest of India and then the justification for the British ruling India, I think fits a normal mode of how the West perceived all the non-West places that they colonized or westernized or white man burdenized. I'm trying to think of terms that are not loaded per se, but describe an attitude towards the indigenous population that, like, particularly in the case of India, right, as in many, many places, created a whole different class of people. And something that comes up with both Gandhi and Nehru, and I got agreement with this on both Martin and Minu when we talked about this, is that part of their expectation for better treatment was based on what the English said about themselves and about their rule of law and their government. Now, look, please do not in any way overinterpret this as some ridiculous Anglophilic, they're perfect. But it's a concept. It comes from a place. The English promote it. Whether they follow it or not is a whole other argument. But these guys consumed it, and they bought it, and they believed it. And they're like, oh, but the English aren't standing up to their own shit. We'll hold them responsible.
Yeah.
That very concept is addressed by Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, in his, I think it's like 1963 book, Legitimation Crisis. The West said all these things about spreading democracy, and all these people believed it, and then you've got the Vietnam War. So is that justifiable? So, the English, Nehru goes to, I think it's Cambridge and then the Temple Inn. And these are like, the two of England's most prized, most whatevered institutions of everything that is English and good and just and godlike on the planet. And yet the guy's brown. So it's a problem when he goes somewhere. And so they're not doing, in fact, what they say they do. And, it's a very interesting thing to try and be able to hold both people as individuals and as part of a collective society responsible for the statements, either implicit or explicit, that they say about how people are to be treated and what you do about it, period. The American Civil Rights Movement fits that dilemma or question perfectly. How do people react to the way, at the time, Negroes, right, that was the term they would have used, which in and of itself was derogatory, yet everybody accepted it, be treated. And there were people who were, there were obviously people who were happy that civil rights activists were being abused and water hosed and persecuted. And then there was a whole bunch who probably were like, eh. And then there was a group that was concerned. And, as the group of people who were not directly engaged with the struggle, as in, i.e., victims per se of the segregation or the white supremacist governmental structures of the American federal and state system, they began to recognize the problem because in and of itself, perhaps it shouldn't exist. So for people like Gandhi and Nehru, the question itself is like, why in the world do black laws, which is what they were called, what Gandhi was first resisting in South Africa, why do black laws, by burning a draft card, by burning an ID card, by burning your black certificate that says, hi, this is me, Mohandas K. Gandhi, you are making a direct statement that you do not have a right to treat me differently from that white English person who is part of the same political entity and does all the same rules that I do. So it's an issue of equity, both as member of a civic unit, as well as a sort of a general human rights-y thing.
Okay.
And I would say in all of the cases in these texts, even weirdly enough, the Hitler texts, it's a question of how do you treat people who you are punishing for something.
Right. And yeah, so to move on, that the next chapter was about Hitler.
Yeah.
And Wolfswinkel talks about how Hitler found his way in jail, kind of discovered himself, and was able to use that to kind of catapult himself from when he was released. So I thought it would be interesting to look at that through the lens of the danger of putting people you don't like in jail and kind of trying to silence them, which is a common theme throughout the book, and then it backfiring. And I would argue backfired, probably the most here.
Yeah, I mean, the circumstances around which Hitler are arrested and incarcerated are sort of special and interesting. But let me think. In my introduction, I think it was, I tried to make a wisecrack about backfiring, and my example was Jesus. that, you tried to shut this Jesus of Nazareth guy up, so we'll nail him to a tree, and oh shit, 1.4 billion people are now Christians. And they ended up taking down the religion, if you believe, what's his name, Gibbon, who wrote Fall of the Roman Empire. Sorry, to get back to the question, though, I diverged.
Backfiring people.
Yeah, you can never tell. If the book or the word or the message can get out, it'll probably backfire because you're imprisoning or trying to silence someone who you don't want people to hear in the first place, right? So
it's almost like
the act of Mill, in a sense, says the act of trying to silence something gives it an allure or a veneer of desirability. But I just think that history would seem to indicate that since all empires, all societies, all cultures wax, wane, and disappear, and they all, particularly complex ones, share in common modes of distractive, cultural behavior for masking oppressive social and economic reality, doesn't change from society to society, just the way it looks changes. The spectacle of the public execution in any number of places over time, throughout history and space, has been replaced in many places by the lack of spectacle by it. One of the reasons that theoretically that the West is so appalled by the terrorist organizations that publicly execute people is because they're, quote, publicly executing people. Whereas that was a norm. I'm not excusing, right, anybody, ISIS or whomever, but like that they didn't invent it.
Everybody used to do it.
Everybody used to do it. And when Thomas Paine wrote in not in the Age of Reason, but in The Rights of Man, people were complaining about how violent the revolutionaries were. And he said, well, where do you think the revolutionaries looked and learned their violence from? You see kings, and you read Foucault, you see kings chopping off heads, cutting out limbs, gutting you, drawing and quartering you, cutting your liver out or your intestines out in front of you and showing them to you. So, in that regard, then it becomes who's taking what from what, and this then ties back to the Gandhi question or the Thoreau question or the Nehru question: is at what point do you get to resist violently or physically? And the American Declaration of Independence says it comes to a point where you have to take up arms. And the American Revolution used violence and I'm not trying to pick us up for particular nastiness, but it's true that our political/military victory over the British became a justification for the establishment of a state based on a thing written by a group of people in charge of something. And so that becomes a model for the creation of the modern nation state. That political control can be established through the means of violence, either in domestic internal violence, like prisons, or war to establish your identity as a people and a state, which, as I talk about in the introduction, Charles Tilly says, in the early modern period, during the nation-state period, the ability to wage war drove the regularization and the codification of means of getting taxes, taking taxes, punishing people for not taking taxes, all to create a carceral infrastructure to extract and then punish people for not paying off properly. He compared it to organized crime.
It's a racket.
Right.
So Gramsci,
yes,
I'm going to say, focused on the role of intellectuals in social order. And I thought it was really interesting point that he felt that intellectuals were not these sort of neutral, apolitical seekers of knowledge, but actually served to legitimize a social order and culturally indoctrinate people into consenting to that order, which is just a really interesting way of thinking about what intellectuals are there for and what they're up to. And so obviously this is what we're constantly bombarded with today. None of us has the time to be an expert in everything, so there's specialization. There's people that know a lot about very particular things that write opinion, papers, go on TV, whatever. So they have a large role in our society, and I guess I'm curious about, the extent to which we should think about that when we're considering what these intellectuals are telling us?
Well, I mean, first off, if Gramsci were alive today and witnessing, for example, the current crisis in the American Republic, I think, his head would spin around and pop off. Because if you're talking about, like, what's the responsibility to do what about what, we've got a bunch of, and who's supposed to do whatever it is it's supposed to do, should be a huge question in a very big, very complex governmental system. So an intellectual, he would argue, because they're theoretically experts in their field, like Chomsky says later, have responsibility to point out when something that someone says about an element of society or the result of a program isn't true or accurate. You have a ethical responsibility as an expert, or like a mathematician should point out to you that I hope I'm not oversimplifying, but a mathematician should point out to you that 2 + 2 isn't 5. So intellectuals, as members of what had traditionally been called the knowledge class, the scribes, the priests, the high priests, and whatever, are responsible for disseminating and creating and disseminating what is ultimately a form of indoctrination, which is culture and beliefs. And then in the modern world, you have a counter to that, i.e. the public sphere, the fourth estate, the intellectual caste, which is virtually dead in the world. There's one guy, 2 guys left. What is their responsibility? He would argue that, like, again, what's-his-face Chomsky does later, they have literally responsibility to point out and say, this is bullshit. This is not going to work. This is not true. This is not real. Even Paul Krugman says essentially the same thing. So it's also something that's discussed with artists in other areas, by the way. Like, what is an artist's responsibility in regard to the status quo and change? So
so artists have that same responsibility?
Yeah, artists would have that same responsibility, because I think he'd include them in the, quote, intellectual class, unquote.
Yeah.
But again, in much of the literature or philosophy and writing about democracy and democratic republics, citizens themselves become also responsible for standing up for what's the right thing. I mean, that's what the civil rights movement was about, right? Drawing in the mass of the population to say, yeah, sitting at the lunch counter, that should be everybody's thing. That should be everybody's thing.
Many of the authors were changed, or probably all of them were changed in some way by their time in prison, but Valenti really speaks to how Said Qutb's 11-year prison term in Egypt completely radicalized him, and it seems like just far more so than anyone else. He went in one person, he came out another.
Yeah.
So why was this in particular, and how did this transform who he was and then lead him to become the writer that's the popular writer he is today?
Well, of course, this is like only my personal hypothesis, and I certainly imagine there's many other possible ways to explain this, to answer that question, right, and explain that thing.
Sure.
I do think you're right that he seems to fit the most transformed by the experience of the writers. If I would just think for a minute about the writers. Yeah, and I think so. I think because, he kind of reminded me of like mid-20th century American relative free thinker, in a sense, that he was questioning the ethics of the society around him and finding them coming up short in what they claimed they were doing. Right? So the Islamic world itself wasn't even Islamic enough for him. And one of the big misunderstandings is, as it's applied to people like Osama bin Laden from Al-Qaeda, is that, the Islamic revolution is going to start with us, me, Al-Qaeda, here in us, me, this Islamic country. But Khatib said that none of you people are actually good enough. Like, we really got to start over again. So I think that his experience in prisons with people who called themselves Muslims, who claimed to be part of this Quranic or Islamic culture with had a set of values, and were obviously violating it. And what was it that he was doing? He was simply putting forth ideas about how you should treat each other. And you have to remember that the story of the, quote, liberation or decolonization of Egypt is a really important one here, because it goes from being a monarchy ruled by the British to a dictatorship allowed or encouraged or at least or facilitated by the Anglo-American foreign diplomatic power structure. Mm-hmm. And Nasser takes over, and in his struggle against the colonial power, he draws in people like Khatib and the Muslim Brotherhood because they can work together against, quote, a common enemy. Once Nasser is established in power, he goes after the people who are his rivals. Khatib fits that profile as well. So what he's doing, in a sense, with these texts, and I think Valenti does a really good job at this, is he's not talking about the West really, per se, in any direct way. Like the whole thing about it was this dance at a church, you know, that, oh my God,
right.
Women. It's the Islamic world and the Islamic's world behavior, I think, Peter is saying, that plays the greatest role in the critique and in the solutions he proposes. As a reader of the Quran, I mean, it's very similar, I would argue, in some ways, to what happened in Europe during the Reformation, when for the first time people got Bibles on their own. And then you got a whole different bunch of interpretations of what those holy books meant. And Khatib was not an official cleric, but he was by all means a very well qualified and very well educated layman who was taken seriously on the subjects he wrote about. And there's a lot of examples of that in 19th and 20th century Anglo-American and 16th and 17th century European secular writers about theological questions and topics.
So the book ends with Martin Luther King Jr. and the letters from a Birmingham jail. And the letters talk about the difference between just and unjust laws. So I want to get into that a little bit and try and ask you actually to try and help us think through what those differences might be and how we can use those two categories to help us sort through what's happening today with our laws.
I mean, I guess I'm allowed the preliminary statement that unfortunately or fortunately, take your pick, not everybody has the same idea of justice, right? I mean, this is a problem. You know, again, your last question, what would you do? Well, I what would I change? Like I said, I would change it so that this book couldn't be written, which meant that justice would be an idea that everybody agrees upon, that's actually followed out, that in my mind is like humane and humanist. Doesn't degrade, doesn't, you know, all the things in which Western culture, at least, because that's the one I know best philosophically, claim that they're about. And that would come from, again, like the Habermas legitimation crisis thing. Martin Luther King, again, like he's a person who's holding up the United States, if one could say that, to its own statements. You say all men are created equal, but we can't parade, you know. And the example he uses of the parade is maybe the best I can do, and then I'll try another one. He makes the argument that it's perfectly reasonable to have laws about having permits for parades, so like things can be orderly under normal circumstances. But in this instance, what's happening is beyond normal. It is a political, social, cultural upheaval that is different from, this is the colonists, if one may make the analogy, rallying in the square at X town in 1773 against the monarch, right? It's the people, right? So they're coming to claim their sovereignty in that regard. And so that is a common problem throughout all the texts in the book, that people are trying to claim their sovereignty in a state that doesn't recognize their ability to be equals in treatment. And prison is often used as a way to make sure you know you're not equal, you know you're not in power. We can snatch you off the street whenever we want. We can make you disappear. And when, you know, one of the questions you had on there we didn't get to is about, like, what do the symbols sort of mean of justice when I say that it's culturally impactful, that they validate it. It's like, well, it's like the world is a giant Milgram experiment. When we see symbols of what we are told are authority, we figure things often are going the way they're supposed to, because the people who look like they're in charge are doing the in charge thing. And so to be dissident against that, which again most of these people were, much to their own maybe chagrin at some level, was against a dominant ruling order that says we know what's right because essentially it's what works best for us. And the letter from a Birmingham jail calls that very concept into question of who us is. And who gets served by ideas like a constitution. Who is we in the sentence is we the people.
I mean, so unjust ones are the ones that people that were created by authority figures to further their ends.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to go with like a Lockean 18th century, quote, liberal answer, yeah, government is created to protect you from those things which you can't protect yourself and to make sure your rights as an equal member of a polity are ensured. And what Locke says, and what the Declaration of Independence says, and take that for whatever that's worth, is that when a government stops doing that, you've got to stand up against it. So unjust may be when a government's doing things it's not supposed to be doing. Now, the question is whether having paramilitarized police round up protesters is actually something that, and the way they do it, violently, non-violently, politely, impolitely, is valid given whatever the circumstances are. And in this case, you're going to have the people doing the enforcing defining what is just, arguably, in a very different way than the people who are being enforced upon. The very idea that you could have a public rally about an idea and actually expect a paramilitary force to show up is a basic fundamental question of do we have free speech in a country like the United States at all itself?
Yeah.
I mean,
which is ongoing.
Right.
We saw
and it's
it with
getting
Occupy.
worse and worse.
Yeah.
There was footage I saw of something a couple of weeks ago where all the police officers, and in various versions of this, all looked like they came out of some Sylvester Stallone dystopic movie cop thing.
Yeah.
Where they were in all this armor with like torpedoes attached to their shoulders and headgear and electric prods, and it was staggering.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a free society? And part of the text addresses how the world, and I had this epilogue that didn't get into the book because of length reasons. And it's like the world's kind of been turned inside out by those who have the ability to live in gated communities. They don't have to interact with the rest of the world, and the rest of us are contained in our little political and economic bubbles by the authorities who are invested with the ability to use violence, coercion, and the state to, quote, keep you in line, unquote. And again, that's not special to the United States or to China or to Russia or to whatever. It seems to be a constant whenever you had government and property or property and government.
Just happens.
Yeah.
Huh.
And maybe because people are shitheads. See, like that goes back to your first question or second question. Why has this happened? Well, it's happened for a really long time. I'm sure hunter-gatherers, there were guys who were jerks too, even though distributionally wise, it was a far more equitable society as far as I've been led to understand things. So anthropologists write in and tell me I'm wrong. But once you got property, there was imbalance, and force was used to keep imbalance. And that hasn't changed. That's Marx, class struggle. I can't take credit for that.
Yeah.
That's his spiel. He's just right about it.
Fair enough. All right. Well, I think we're pretty good there. Is there anything
Great.
else in particular you wanted to make sure you got across to people about the book? Any big ideas we didn't have a chance to talk about?
Well, I don't know. I guess it's the idea that we as America or we as Western society are in no way immune from all the abuses that this book highlights in past societies and in perhaps other contemporary societies. We obviously need, like Socrates would say, look at ourselves first. Or I think Thoreau would certainly say, look at yourself first. And if I might quote Jesus himself, he says, don't worry about the speck in your brother's eye. Look at the plank in your own. Right? The American political system has created a prison industrial complex that is horrifying from any aspect you look at it. And I mean any word or any category you can come up with, it's a bad scene, man. And we've got like 100,000 people, for example, kept in solitary confinement, in 80,000 in federal supermaxes, and like 20,000 in state and local jails, sometimes for things like being, drug kingpins, but there aren't that many, usually murderers or somehow protective custody for being in prison. But like we need to rethink, I would argue, the United States and the West as a whole, and obviously then the world, what in the world are we really doing with prisons and war? And the mechanisms of, as what I think the book is about mostly, sanctioned political violence. Because the thing that seems consistent, except with Hitler, is that most of these people are vindicated in what it is they're being persecuted for or against. They do have a statue of Martin Luther King. They don't have a statue of Sheriff Bull Connor, no matter how much some folks might want that.
Yeah.
And I will easily agree with you that a statue of Martin Luther King Jr. by no means means the struggle is over. Are you giving me a break? As Lenin points out, once you start lauding figures who used to be revolutionary, their revolutionary power may be over. I don't know. But these people have been vindicated. Their struggle has been vindicated as far as history is concerned. Nehru goes from prison to prime minister virtually. That's pretty heavy.
Yeah.
You look at Burma now, similar situation. This woman has been there and fought and fought and fought. So I don't know, man. Maybe the takeaway is the fight, whatever that means to you personally, is always worth it, because we don't necessarily know the results. I don't think that the people in this book necessarily had pre-existing messianic complexes, who were looking to get sent to jail to be persecuted to, become famous or whatever,
Right.
man.
That wasn't the plan.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary person who can do the things that not only that are done in this book in the struggle for freedom and liberty and equality, but more importantly, the billions of people throughout history who we don't know about, who died in the name of, equal treatment, better rights, a more equitable distribution of wealth and prosperity and happiness.
Yeah. So on that note, I'd like to transition to the Thunder Round. Just ask a couple quick
Sure.
questions, wrap it up.
I
So
had to
about
think-
you.
I had to think about these before.
You did? I know.
Yeah.
These are some good ones. What's
Yeah.
your favorite food or drink?
I guess dessert.
Oh. Yeah.
But-
What's your favorite? Come on. Just straight sugar.
Well, I'm a type 2 diabetic, so I'm not supposed to be into
Ah.
endocrinologist, so I get in trouble.
Okay.
But I like dessert, so I don't know.
Fruit can be dessert,
Fruit
right?
can be dessert, but the glycemic index there is almost as bad
Oh,
as
really?
if you
Yeah.
have tiramisu, so I may as well have the tiramisu. So
Okay.
I'll just say that then.
Fair enough. See, goes back to you just liking the skirt danger.
I guess so, yeah. Woo,
danger.
man, I'm having a cupcake. Look
Yeah.
out. Wah! Some really straight edge rock band's party after
Yeah,
the show.
right.
Like
Some cake.
cupcakes
Yeah.
and like soda. Whoa, no, man, put the Dr. Pepper down, man. That's like your third cup. Too much birch beer, man.
Wild thing. So, where's your favorite place you've ever been?
I thought about that a lot. I think Slovenia.
Okay. I'm headed to
Although I
Eastern
really
Europe.
like Spain. I go into Spain again, hopefully soon.
Yeah. What's in Slovenia?
There's a lot of Ljubljana for the first place, which is a beautiful little city.
Okay.
But like great country, great food, really nice people. It just was really pleasant experience every time I went there.
Sounds great. And you answered this in part a couple times, but I want to hear your full answer. So I'll ask, if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
The silence you're hearing is me trying to figure out the best way to put that answer. It's such a difficult question, and given the topic of the book, I think has gravitas behind it. So again, like I said, it's the impossible dream that this book wasn't necessary. That humans didn't have the problem that we were trying to talk about earlier. That we do, as I say, one of the biggest problems is how do you run our own society? We seem to have problems with running societies that don't follow their own rules, which then end up treating people, badly, oppressively, violently, exploitatively. So I guess I wish that would go away. and that's all I can muster, and it's huge and sort of ridiculous. But given, I think, the context of the book, and if you look at the news around us right now, today, can I say the day we're recording? Is that
Yeah.
all right? We're on May 19th in 2017, and the president And the United States may or may not be entering a huge political and constitutional crisis. And then what we do with that, how we play that out, is plays directly into what goes on in this book and how our state responds to people fighting about this question. So if we could all be more humane, if society and people and institutions were more humane, that would be my terribly
I mean, you got to think big. You got to have goals, dreams, right?
Yeah.
So I love that answer, and that's a great way to wrap it up. So again, I've been speaking with Ward Regan, editor, writer of great books written in prison. And if you want to get much more in depth to all these great topics we've been discussing, you can. The book is wonderful. And I just want to say, Ward, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm really kind of, humbled that you want to bother to talk about my book. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.